Thank you very much. So I guess the first thing to say is that this is actually not my talk. The CTO for OpenZeppelin, Jonathan Alexander, was originally going to be given this talk, but instead he's riding out a hurricane in Florida right now, or at least will be soon. I did go over this with him, so I'll basically kind of convey a lot of what he conveyed. These are discussions we've essentially had about how we can do security better, really just borrowing from a lot of what Web2 did. And then I'll also be giving a talk tomorrow around the same time that talks more about security specifically focused on DAOs. So if you're interested, so this is going to be a little bit more high level, and the one tomorrow is going to be a bit more like specific for some DAO examples. So let's get into it. So again, we're first going to go through Web2 versus Web3 security. We're going to go through best practices, some principles and controls you can take from that, and then finally, like how you apply that to a Web3 strategy that is effectively defense in depth, which is to say there's not a single point of failure. There's multiple layers you have to get through in order for a bug to make it into production, as well as for something that does go wrong in production to not be quickly resolved. So first of all, Web2 versus Web3 security. The issues are actually kind of the same. We think of them as very different places because a lot of professionals in Web2 don't work on Web3 as much, and vice versa, although that is changing a little bit over time. And most of what Web2 is trying to do is not really protect money, because money isn't in a digital format. It's usually locked down in banking systems that have long settlement times, so you don't really have to worry about someone running away with the money in most cases, although it's certainly still an issue. It's usually protecting data. Whereas Web3, we're actually trying to protect money that could run away and never come back. But still, like, other than that difference in terms of what kind of value loss we're seeing, the issues that are coming up are still very similar. We're still getting software bugs that give people the access they shouldn't. We're still seeing supply chain vulnerabilities where a lot of dependencies that you have in your code are creating issues that you couldn't foresee outside of the scope of your own code. So you have to not just worry about like what your code is, but also all the packages and libraries, and even on-chain dependencies like DEXs and oracles and other things like that. We're seeing phishing and fraud. We're seeing people that, regardless of how secure the code is, are able to tell someone to do something they shouldn't. Like one case I saw recently was someone signed away all the rights to their Tether in their account, which ended up being up to $700,000. This was an individual CPA that was just trying to invest money. And he thought he was interacting with a smart contract, but he was actually just interacting with an EOA. And when he signed a transaction, he basically gave away access to his entire account. He didn't even know it. And many other issues like that, Discord usernames being spoofed, other stuff. And then, of course, leaked private keys. The whole point of the system is that the private key, not your keys, not your crypto. But of course, if you don't protect your keys or you don't have a good infrastructure around how key management's done at an organizational level, the smart contract isn't going to protect you. Blockchain is not going to protect you if the whole recognition of right is stolen and then used to move money away or do something else malicious. And then finally, denial of service. You can have things shut down unexpectedly if someone's depending on, for example, an Oracle feed, and they're running a lending market, and this is something that came up with Compound recently. You could have denial of service, and this is not even a malicious attack, but there could be other examples where it is malicious. So if I can keep you from getting a price feed, I could potentially cause a lot of issues in your marketplace because prices become misaligned, and then other issues follow from there. So when we look at Web2 and we try to think, OK, what have we already learned in the Web2 world that we don't have to relearn really painful lessons again in Web3, the best places to look are these two standards. One is SOC 2 and the other is ISO 27001. These are both well-known standards in the security space for doing Web2 security. And the idea is really to be as comprehensive as possible, to cover all the bases and to make sure that if someone's going into production or someone wants to get certified as being safe, if they follow all these criteria, they should be safe. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, standards are always going to be limited in what they can cover. But for the most part, it gives you a really good bench line to build a more secure system. In general, SOC 2 is usually more used in North America by cloud providers. ISO 27001 is a little bit more flexible for IT. It's also a little bit more heavy, so we're going to talk more about SOC 2 and basically dive in deeper and see, OK, how can we map this over into Web3? So first, with SOC 2, it starts with a set of principles, which is really just how you're going to maintain your systems. How secure is it going to be? How available? How do you ensure integrity? How do you ensure confidentiality and privacy? Under each principle, there are then tools that you will utilize. For security specifically, you will have two-factor authentication. You'll have a good firewall. You'll have intrusion detection so that you know if something's going wrong. And skipping around, like privacy could be access control, again, two-factor authentication, encryption. And I could go through every one of these items, but I think most of you understand this. And in fact, many existing Web3 companies, like say Coinbase, that have effectively Web2 systems as a centralized exchange, already have to follow these principles. They already go through SOC 2 and compliance. And many crypto exchanges, ever since the very hard lesson we all learned from Mt. Gox, have been pretty focused on following SOC 2 or something very similar like it. But the question is, now that we're moving to smart contracts, how would that criteria be broken down? So we look at control environment, we look at the communication, the risk assessment. What kind of risks do you have to be aware of? What threat and incident response sort of training are you doing? Who has controls? Like just documenting who has the ability to respond to threats, who has these permissions, so that if anything is ever out of whack or if you're not in a state of preparedness, you know essentially what needs to be solved quickly, as opposed to just like, basically figuring out what your incident response strategy is as the incident is occurring. That's typically far slower and far more prone to error, and we don't want to put people in that position, especially developers who are already doing plenty in the Web3 space to try to build things securely, much less have to then drop what they're doing, respond to something, and make up everything as they go. It's kind of similar to, I guess, airline checklists. When the turbine goes out in your airplane, what do? Well, most pilots, instead of just reacting on instinct or just making it up as they go, thinking, I'll roll the plane, that'll definitely do something, or you never know what's going on. There's actually a checklist that most pilots can refer to. If a certain light blinks, if a certain thing goes wrong, there's a checklist of do this, try this, assess this, check if it's that. And usually that has resolved in even like monumentally terrible like incidents where a whole turbine goes out, or the cabin's depressurized, or things that could end with the whole plane going down. The pilots know how to react and have the best chance of recovery. And again, if I would go back to like, let's say, an example of like pre-deployment, which is to say, before we start flying the plane, how do we make sure the plane is safe? There are a ton of processes that people go through to get a plane into production. And in some ways, it might be even more extensive than it needs to be, but the level of security ensures that we never have disasters that put human lives at risk, or at the very least, we've done everything we can to avoid it. And so when we see billions of dollars at risk in DeFi, we have to start considering, are these the same principles and the same rigor, or at least similar rigor, that we should be applying to security now? And again, it will be different in many ways, but the principles, I think, are going to be the easiest to take, because a lot of them ultimately have very similar overlap, monitoring, control activities, and some of them might be easier to implement in Web3, or at the very least, easier to program. The ability to have access control in the smart contract, saying these keys or this multisig have permissions to do this. You can actually make that very explicit, and many people do that today. But I think what a lot of people aren't doing today with security in Web3 is they're not doing it based on principles. They're doing it based on, well, I think my gut check is a multisig with 4 out of 7 signers is probably going to be fine. And that's usually done by people that are usually doing it with good understanding. They're usually very experienced at building smart contracts. But a lot of new teams coming in, or a lot of new teams being formed that are trying to build these products or build on top of them, might not know intuitively what's the best strategy for security. And that's where I think basically building principles around Web3 using what we already have in Web2 is going to be really important. And companies like OpenZeppelin, a lot of other security companies are working with clients to help them with our expertise to be as secure as possible. But there's only so many of us. Many other of our security competitors, and I say competitors loosely because we hardly compete for work today. There's so much out there, we can't get to everyone. And so having principles so people can start building before they even have to talk to a security professional, or at least start to build an internal security team, is going to be really important, because it doesn't scale otherwise. So with all that said, let's look at Web3 in more detail. What does defense in depth really mean? Well, these are just some quick lines that you can send to your security team or keep in mind for your development to actually start to implement. So first of all, multi-factor authentication for anything that comes close to touching code. If you are using GitHub for your code, that's where maybe your audit reports live, your smart contract code. Maybe your deployment pipeline that eventually leads on-chain is even tied into GitHub, or deployment pipeline for off-chain infra that supports it. Secure that. If you're not using multi-factor authentication for anything that even comes close to touching it, even the Twitter account that you use to tell people, hey, send money to this address whenever you're trying to do a token sale, if you don't have that locked down, that could defraud investors without them even touching your smart contract. So anything that you as a team are doing with like normal login credentials, if you're not using multi-factor authentication, you are likely at risk. All it takes is one SIM card getting spoofed or one person losing their phone, and then suddenly you have a massive catastrophe on your hands because someone has access to something they shouldn't in the Web2 world without even having to go after Web3. And then finally, once we get into the actual, like, let's say, Solidity smart contracts you're deploying or some other smart contract framework, the standards you use for coding. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of opinions about what's good code and what's bad code, but generally speaking, strive for clarity, strive for readability. That's the biggest thing that we try to do in the OpenZeppelin contract library, but we also encourage our clients to do. And some things can't be made clear, like maybe you have to deal with assembly or do a delegate call because that's just the functionality that you need to get after. But when you're doing that, make sure you're documenting it heavily, not just in documentation, but also in the code itself through NatSpec or other things, so you can tell any developer reading it, or maybe auditor, what it's supposed to be doing so that they can check that and be aware of any unsafe ways you might have to avoid using it or anything like that. And that basically is no code without documented design and design review. Keeping an eye on security, keeping an eye on what are the threats that we're designing the system to protect against in the first place. Don't add bloat. Try to avoid, if you can write something cleaner or shorter, definitely do that. But I think that also goes further in terms of focusing on clean designs that don't lump everything into a monolithic structure or otherwise just don't distract from the core design of the system that leads someone to understand what the security intent is and be able to fact check it. 100% unit test coverage with the so-so, which is to say some things are difficult to test, some things aren't fully covered, and sometimes people are just going for that 100% check mark of I have 100% unit test coverage, but then you look at the tests and they're not actually testing with true data, or maybe they're mocking a lot of the external calls or doing other things. So that is to say all of this is very opinionated, but you should be striving for unit tests that test positive and negative cases. That can also include fuzzing, that can also include formal verification, but even just general unit tests as a starting point is going to be far better than nothing. Finally, identify and test your invariance, which is to say, okay, what for sure should never happen or what should the system always strive to achieve, and make sure that that is always being achieved both in how you're testing it pre-deployment and how you're monitoring it post-deployment. If those invariants are ever broken, you have a very clear indication something is wrong and you can address it as early as possible. Finally, having 2 code reviewers on all smart contract changes. Note, when I say 2 code reviewers, I don't mean auditors. That's separate. I mean people on your team that understand that code, that work with you, or at least someone that is going to be a developer working on it, that can basically give you feedback and understand it. And maybe in some cases just, we always want to go to production quickly, actually taking the time to, read through the code for a week. Don't do any new feature changes. Just read through the code, make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. Maybe do some important security features that you felt were optional, but you can have the time to do it. So just having the time available. Static analysis, I already said fuzzing, formal verification. And then finally, integration testing in a stage environment with a fork network. And this is actually something that came up with a recent deployment through Compound, where basically, and we were working with them, we audited it, but there was not a proper testing on essentially the fork network. Which is to say they were assuming a price feed was going to work a certain way based on the code that they had in that repo, which they were assuming essentially that a smart contract that was already deployed years ago was going to work a certain way. It turns out it didn't. But if they had done testing on the fork network, then that would have been immediately seen and could have been prevented entirely. And this is something just in general. Like if you have this live blockchain network, there are great tools out there like Hardhat and Foundry for forking it and testing it. Please do so. Try to avoid mocking as much as possible because that's usually where integration issues sneak in. And then finally, release security. Audit before release. That's what we always recommend, whether it's with us or our competitors. Generally speaking, even multiple audits or audit contests like Code Arena. Establish risk analysis, like when you're releasing something, what are the risks? What could go wrong? How would we address it? Don't just push it out and then hope it all goes well. Make sure you have a plan to ensure it goes well or respond to anything that doesn't go well. Have a separation of duties, so the developer is not the releaser, or at the very least, someone's working with the developer on the release. So it's not all on just one person. Someone can fact check them. And then finally, simulation test, smoke test, simulation test before, smoke test after, and then maintain the ability to revert if something goes wrong, which is to say if your contract's already upgradable, then you might as well also have the ability to revert. This is something with essentially time locks where time locks are great for doing deployments slowly, but you might also want to have a quicker way to reverse that. So I think that is about in a time. Operational security, I'm not going to get to that, but bug bounties, health techs, multi-sigs, governance, monitoring. There's a lot of stuff. And also, if something goes wrong, do a postmortem, tell people why and what you're going to do better next time. So finally, and then you already saw that, so I'll skip to the end and say thank you. And if you are interested in talking to me or anyone else from OpenZeppelin, we will be doing a happy hour later today at 5 p.m. We might be booked up on that, but you can always try. Just like audits, right? So thank you, everyone, and hope you have a good rest of the day.